You live? Good afternoon. I'm Are we good to go? Thank you. I'm Scott Wood, VU1QD. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce our next speaker, George Nicholson. George is a member of this club, and he's also a member of a club in Atlanta, Georgia, where he calls home, his main home. However, he has been increasingly spending a number of months in Lockport, Nova Scotia, where he has a house, and he has the call sign VE1GRN as well as N4GRN. So George has dabbled in electronics from an early age, but he didn't get around to getting a license very soon. He was building Heathkit equipment when he was younger, and perhaps he was stymied a little bit by having to have a code capability. And it wasn't really before 2004 that he actually got a license to operate in the US. Well, George has made up in spades for the lost time, because he's been on a wild ride doing wild and exotic DXpeditioning, and he has probably crammed more amateur radio into the last 20-some years than most of us into our whole lifetime. George, his background is an engineer, is that right? Yeah, engineer. He also operates a construction company in Atlanta, Georgia. And he has been a very desired person on DXpeditions because of his capability with logistics. And so he has been on maybe a half dozen major DXpeditions to some pretty wild and difficult places, such as Peter the First Island in the Antarctic, and South Sandwich Islands, Desacheo, Malapelo, Navassa, Pitcairn, and Ghana recently. He's been to a second time to Bouvet, or when he was at Bouvet, but it was a failed expedition, which he probably will comment on. George, as a Halifax Amateur Radio Club member, whenever there's a DXpedition he's been on, he's always wearing one of our hats, which we appreciate. And he's been our speaker on a number of occasions at the Maritime DX Forum when we operated that. I got to know George, and especially well when I was involved with that activity, because when I went down to Dayton, he and his friend Wes Lamboli, W5, what? It's W3. I thought it was W3 WL. Took me under their wing, and I piggybacked on their fame and got drawn into contact with all kinds of very interesting people in the DX world, and some of whom we were able to get up here as speakers as a result of that. So I really appreciated the great help that he gave us, and he's going to talk today about some of the wild and exotic DXpeditions that he's been on, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And he's got some pretty interesting tales to tell. George, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Scott. I also appreciate the topic that you chose for me. Hopefully you'll find it interesting. I got started in 2004, as Scott said. I had built Heathkits and been involved in electronics and all since the age of about 12 years old, but did not have any mentors anywhere within 100 miles of where I lived, so code was a big problem. I could never learn the code. So I got involved in college and marriage and business, and ham radio sort of was forgotten for a number of years. And then I found out I was going to have open heart surgery and would be at home quite a bit and needed something to keep me busy. So I got busy and took my ham license in 2004, and shortly after that had my open heart surgery. My surgeon was a ham. My cardiologist was also a ham in Atlanta. My surgeon is one of the top cardiac surgeons in the Southeast, and he also was president of the Southeast DX Club. And when I was having my last stent put in, my doctor said, "You're going to have to bite the bullet and have surgery." And I said, "Who's the best around?" And they said, "Jim Cowton." And I said, "I know Jim. I just met him 3 days ago putting up a towel with a friend. Get me out of the procedure room and I'll give him a call." I said, "You won't get him. He's booked round the clock." So I called Jim. Jim says, "Be in the office Monday morning." Monday morning I was in his office. This was a Thursday. Monday morning I was in his office. Wednesday I had the open heart surgery. Thursday morning I'm in the step-down unit, and Jim comes in to see me along with Wes Lamboli. And as they were walking in the door, I heard them talking about a DXpedition to Peter I Island that had been canceled that morning because of shipping problems. Later I found out, I raised one finger up and said, "Good, I'll be there next year." Didn't remember it. Several months later, Wes Lamboli called me and said, "Would you be interested in going to Dayton this year?" And I said, "Certainly." So we're on the way to Dayton. Wes says, "I've got an appointment with you tomorrow morning for breakfast with the team leaders of Peter I, if you're really interested." And I said, "Well, sure, but I'm a brand new ham. I've got no experience. I'm sure there's a long list. But yes, I'd love to talk to him." Well, as it turns out, I was put on the Peter I team. I took the place of Mike Mraz, who had to drop out, and initially I was responsible for power infrastructure, satellite communications, and some of the island infrastructure that was needed. As it turned out, before the project took place, there's about a 2-year period minimum needed to organize these trips. So during the next 2 years, I got involved in all of the logistics of the Peter I trip. And it was intense. Had no idea how intense it was going to be. We had a 9-page spreadsheet with inventories of everything, starting off with the camp infrastructure, the power infrastructure, food and waste, then the radio infrastructure. Long list. Took about a year to get the final list together, get all the vendors' supplies into the Atlanta location, stage everything into this 40-foot shipping container, get it shipped to South America. All the best planning and organizing you can do does not always work out. So we get to South America in 2005, December of 2005, a year after my open heart surgery, and the ship fell through after we were all there, and an international group from many countries. Ship fell through. We had to leave, ship the container back to the States, start over again. In early 2006, we were able to acquire another ship, shipped everything down. We got everything on the ship, and we were in good shape. This particular, and if you advance the slide one, please. Keep advancing. I've got a lot of slides we're going to skip through. Peter I, one of the things that happens on these DXpeditions is it's an international group, the group I've done these with. It's always a lot of fun getting together at the departure point, meeting everybody that you've not met, friends you haven't seen in years. And with me, I didn't know most of these people. I'd never met them before, so it was a lot of fun, a lot of eating, drinking, meetings before you depart. After you depart, go ahead and advance again. After you depart, you've got the unpacking of the container on the ship usually, staging things to helicopter or Zodiac to the island. This is a shot of the container at Peter I on the ship. We had started unloading some of the items. The 40-foot container was packed front to back. We barely got the door closed. we get everything staged and ready. We get to Peter 1. As we knew the weather was not good, it took about 2 days after we arrived at Peter 1 before we were able to have the first recon flight to the island, advance another. And we had advance one more. I've got some of these slides out of order. Advance one more. Another one, please. This is the fuel, the propane tanks that were on the ship. For the heat, for the Meg tent, the only thing that we had heat for was the eating, greeting tent called the Meg tent. We had it for the cooking and for eating, for heating. Advance again, please. On the ship, after we got everything unloaded and safely secured on the ship, I was elected to do the first internet connection from that part of Antarctica. At that time, none of the satellite services had ability there except for Iridium. And Iridium had an extremely low bandwidth. So getting anything other than a text message out was going to be difficult. I worked with the Iridium engineers, and there had been a recent trip to Greenland where they had multi-banked 5 or 6 sat phones together, had them use the old Microsoft dialing application, and we'd multi-dial all of the phones one at a time. They would link together and increase the bandwidth. So we were able to get somewhere around 20 to 24 kilobit bandwidth, which was not much, but we were able to send some decent pictures and some small video clips back. That worked out real well. Everything was going real good. We get to the island, advance again. We get to the island after some rough seas and seasickness and all of these things. Again, please. Then we start the transport from the ship to the island. Like I say, it took about 3 days to get some decent weather for the helicopter to fly. I stayed on board for the first 2 trips to the island and helped determine what was going to be shipped first, second, third. Then I flew to the island after that. But advance again, please. This is just a shot in the bottom of the ship showing the diesel fuel for the helicopters and the petroleum for the generators. Advance again, please. This is where the problems came in. We had a bay door that the Zodiac was deployed from, which we didn't use as access to the island. But the bay door became a problem while we were on the island, and the hams didn't know that it was a problem until a year later. Water had splashed in, and the ship was lisping at about a 40-degree angle due to the water that had accumulated that day. A Zodiac had left and didn't close the door. Advance again, please. And like I say, these are out of order, I'm sorry. This is the helicopter flights to the island. Again, please. This is the infrastructure after it was set up. We're on the island not knowing anything about a problem. Well, it took them 5 days to pump the water out and get the ship leveled out again. Again, please. This is what the biggest problem on the island was, uncovering things after storms. This was the second morning we were there. Again, please. This is where we had the food stored, the frozen food stored. We had a hole in the ground in the ice and a piece of plywood over it, and we put the frozen food in it. Again, please. Well, this is out of order. This is the Zodiac that had flipped over, that left the ship without closing the bay door. They are bailing water out with their boots. And we didn't know anything, like I say, about this while we were on the island operating and having fun. Again, please. This was the Meg tent where we gathered and ate and had meetings and just general hangout location when we were not operating. Our schedule was 3 hours on, 3 hours off, 3 hours on, 3 off. And then you had a 6-hour period for eating, sleeping, and maintaining camp. and then you started your 3-3-3 again for the 14 days. So it's pretty intense doing these. There's a lot of camp maintenance that takes place during your 6-hour shift that you're off. Tightening up antennas, tightening up shelter, strapping, and things of that nature. Advance again, please. And I can't tell what this one is. The island, we didn't have much bad weather while we were there. We had a couple of storms. One of the storms, there was so much powdered snow that when we got in the sleep tents that afternoon, there was powdered snow all over the sleeping bags. And I had always asked, why did we need waterproof gear if we were going to a place that was going to be below zero? Well, the tents sweat, water drips, your sleeping bags, your clothes get wet from the dripping condensation, and snow like this eventually melts when people get in the shelter. Advance again, please. And I'm having a problem seeing. Oh, this is the, and I'm sorry about these being out of order. I thought I had them in order till we started showing them, and I didn't. While we were on the ship, just before we arrived at Peter I, a sailboat sailed by, and he all of a sudden took a sharp turn away from us. And we tried to radio him, and he would not answer. So one of the Russian team members knew that there was a Russian team doing a circumnavigation of the Antarctic in a sailboat at the same time we were there. Well, it turns out Nikolai, the explorer, and his 3-man crew were afraid that we were a rogue ship, and he didn't want to get close to us, so he had sailed away. After the Russian got on the radio and spoke to him, they came back, boarded the ship. And these are the neat things that happen on these trips. Nikolai is coming aboard after he finally got in his Zodiac. He's jumping the rope ladder, one hand at a time, holding his Parker. And everybody said, what in the world is he holding in his Parker? Well, he gets to the top rung and he says, here, take this. He's got 6 bottles of Russian vodka. So we had a little party with him and his team on board, let them take a shower and eat some hot food. He was a really neat person to meet. You meet all these interesting people on these trips. Advance again, please. This is another shot of what happens. All of these bright people that we've got on this team ended up putting the frozen food, the first day, ended up putting the frozen food in a styrofoam fish chest, which had no ice in it. They put all of the perishables like onions and potatoes and carrots on top of the snow and left it. Well, it got snowed on and we lost most of the vegetables. About half of the meat was lost because of it being in this styrofoam box in the sun. So we had to smell meat and decide if we were going to cook it or not. We ended up with enough food, but it was one of those things that happens. Next slide, please. We did have internet on the island. We were able to send, like I say, the pictures. We were able to do log uploads, text messaging, and emails. That's the little array of satellite antennas sitting on top of the box. We used the storage boxes that we shipped in to house some of the items on the island that were not in the operating tents in the MEG tent. Next slide, please. This is the helicopter that we used. The only real incident we had on the island was when we were leaving. We left 3 days early because there was a terrible storm coming, and we decided to leave early. We got off the island, all but 1 crate and 3 men, and the whiteout rolled in. Helicopter left the 3 men on the island and came to the ship. It was 2 days before we were able to go back and get those people. They had no shelter, no food, and it was fairly decent weather when they went, so they didn't have heavy clothes on. So we were very concerned, as they were for 3 days, about getting them back to the ship. Charles Bealey, carrying the American flag, is not a ham. He was with us. He was the world's most traveled man at that time, and Peter I was one of the last countries he needed. or entities he needed. So he was one of the 3 that got left on the island. The other 2 were the helicopter crew. Next, please. We get back to King George Island, which was our takeoff point for Peter 1. And the morning that we arrived, we didn't realize that there was a tourist group that had flown to King George Island, and the ship we were using was going to take them around the island and show them the wildlife. They took all of the Zodiacs from our ship and all the life vests from our ship and went to the island. Well, 9, 10 o'clock in the morning after breakfast, Bob Alpin and Ralph Fedor and I decided to go down and lock the container up and make sure it was ready to be shipped. So, next slide, please. Well, back up. Well, just leave it there. I don't have any pictures of this because everybody was busy. All of a sudden, smoke was pouring out of the bottom of the ship. Ralph was already down. Bob was already down. I turned around and climbed the ladder up to the bridge to find out what was going on. And we weren't sure whether it was a fire or whether it was, or what it was. We thought it was a fire because of the heavy smoke. And at that point, we had not smelled a chemical smell in the smoke. So we're concerned that there was 2 people missing that we thought were in the bottom of the ship where the fire was. Two of which were my friends, Bob and Ralph. They had gotten out and had gotten back up on the deck and were okay. The 3rd member was a Polish fellow, Robert. I can never remember Robert's call sign. Robert always had chocolate candy with him. Every day he was giving out chocolate candy. We don't know where he had it stashed, but he had a ton of chocolate candy. Robert was unseen. We couldn't find him. Back up one slide. Can you back up one slide? Robert, I'm looking over the side of the ship, and smoke is still pouring out. Robert is laying in the trash Zodiac, eating a candy bar. He had jumped out the bay door that was the problem door into the Zodiac, and this company we used hauled all the trash and empty fuel drums from King George Island back to South America. That was what their regular job was. So all night long, they'd been loading the ship up with empty jet fuel, 55-gallon drums and diesel drums, and we had one level completely full of empty diesel and petroleum and jet fuel drums, which is a explosion waiting to happen. And at this point, we still didn't know whether it was a fire or what, and there was no way to get off the ship. So we had all reconciled that if this thing blows up, there's nothing we can do. Next slide, please. Next, okay. We were real upset that the ship had sent off all of our life vests. There weren't even any life vests on the ship, much less Zodiacs. So as it turned out, what had happened is a container of ammonia had spilled, and it had gotten into some chlorine that had spilled on the floor of a storage room. It heated up and melted a chlorine bucket, which melted another bucket that had more ammonia in it, and it was an ammonium chloride cloud that was coming out of the bottom and not a fire. So when we found that out, we were relieved at some point, that we were not going to blow up. We had to get rid of this problem. So we got rid of the problem. It went away by itself, but the Zodiacs get back. We finally get on board the ship the next morning to head back to South America. We're having a little celebration in this picture on board the ship. These are the fun parts of the trip. After the work's over, you've got a little time to celebrate before you get back to your departure point and have to load the containers and all of that. This was a celebration the first night back on board the ship. Next picture, please. So Peter 1 was not much of a problem. It was a big challenge, and it was a lot of work involved and a lot of logistics involved. But just the possibility of the fire was an issue. We were all scared. And we learned real quick, you need to make sure the ship doesn't take off with all your life vests and Zodiacs. We had no idea that they were going to do that, and they shouldn't have. That was a no-no. So Peter 1 went pretty smooth. The second trip, the first trip was a no-go because the ship did not show up. That was the second ship that did not show up. So 2006 is when we actually got there. This is my Navassa trip. And Navassa, again, was a fairly easy trip. It took about 5 years to get permission to land on Navassa from all the different entities. The biggest problem was Fish and Wildlife. They did not want to allow anybody on the island. So the organizing team went to Congress, and we petitioned for 3 or 4 years before we finally got permission to go to Navassa. That was a 280-page document that was submitted with everything from initial acquiring of permits all the way through cleaning up the island before we left and leaving it pristine. It went through every step of what we were going to do if there was a gas spill or any kind of problem on the island with getting rid of human waste and food waste and things like that. Next slide, please. 245-page proposal. Next slide, please. We get to our location, and Jamaica. And the first thing that happened, we were on a deadline to meet the customs people at the Ian Fleming's airport to start going through the container. Well, the first thing that happens is the bus we had chartered broke down. And we missed meeting customs that day. They had to come the next day, which sort of irritated them. Next slide, please. We found out when we got there that some of the material we had ordered to be staged there that we didn't want to ship, like empty gas cans, had not been acquired. So we had to find a Ace Hardware, of all things, and bought gas cans. Next slide, please. Filled the gas cans, got those to the staging site. This was the party the night before we left. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide. I'm going to skip through a lot of these. At the airport, we got permits to go on the tarmac without having to go through security, so we could come in and out as we were going through and unloading the container. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is Glenn Johnson, our doctor, W0GJ. The Jamaican medical division, I don't remember what it was called, they went through every bottle and every package in all 3 of the medical containers we had, picked it apart, but didn't reject anything, but it just took a long time. Next container, next picture. They also went through all of the MREs, almost every box of the MREs they went through. They had a problem with the MREs that were labeled sausage and biscuits because it said pork sausage. Well, pork was not allowed to be imported into Jamaica. So we convinced them that it was really not pork, it was probably artificial flavoring anyway, since it was MREs. They ended up permitting it, but it took about a day to get that approved. Next slide, please. Then we started staging things to go to the island. We were going by helicopter. It was a long helicopter flight. We had a Bell helicopter, and we were going to not be able to carry slings. We had to put everything inside because of the long flight. So it was like 3 people, maybe 4 in the helicopter. The rest of the helicopter was full of supplies. Next slide, please. This is the helicopter. Next slide, please. I was communicating with Fish and Wildlife. They were in Cuba at Gitmo, is where they left from to meet us on the island. They had to arrive at the island before we did to secure the island. There was Haitians and Cubans that go to the island quite frequently illegally, and they wanted to make sure the island was clear of any dangerous people when we got there. So I was communicating with them to find out when they were leaving Gitmo and when they were arriving on the island. Next slide, please. This is shortly before we took off. Next slide. And this was the last communications with the helicopter from Gitmo before we got in ours. Next slide, please. This is arriving at Navassa. Fish and Wildlife had people around the island scheduled, armed. They were very concerned about potential problems on the island. So we had armed Fish and Wildlife people with us. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is bringing in the second helicopter. Next slide. One of the things we had to do, because of the long flight distance, the helicopter was almost out of fuel. It had about 10% left in the tanks when we got to Jamaica, which is not a good thing, but it was the only way to get there. So we had several containers of fuel on board the helicopter, and we had to refill on the island. They're refilling with a water pump and a water hose, which is not legal at all, and the helicopter pilots got real upset when they saw me taking pictures of the refueling. But everything went well. Next slide. Shortly after the second helicopter flight to the island is when the problem started. The second morning, we were supposed to have a helicopter flight with nothing but food and water and gas. It didn't arrive. Couldn't get anybody on the phone. Sat phone wasn't being answered. Eventually, I got a text message by Iridium to the cell phone of one of the pilots for the helicopter. He texts back, "Our permits have been pulled. They will not allow us on the tarmac, and they will not refuel the helicopter. We can't bring your supplies. What are we going to do?" Well, that was a good question. What are we going to do? Being in charge of logistics, I get on the phone and call some local hams to try to find out who we needed to talk to about why these permits had been canceled. One of the local hams calls back. At this point, we had a V over IP phone set up on the island, so we had actual live phone. One of the local hams calls back and says, Haiti has called Jamaica and told them that you are violating the Haitian air rights, and they're going to shoot the helicopter down if it attempts to go back to Navassa. Well, we weren't real concerned about that because Haiti doesn't have much military, but we didn't want any kind of incident, and Jamaica would not let them leave because of that. So George Waldner, who was doing the rib that was shown in the earlier pictures, the remote access, George Waldner had come to the island with 2 team members on his yacht. He had extra water and extra fuel on the yacht. So that got us through the problem of food, water, and fuel. We had to bring everything from the yacht by Zodiac close to the island. We had to bring it up a transfer line that we set up, and then we had about a mile hike to carry all of this stuff up to the campsite, which it was like 100, 110 degrees, rough terrain. This had not been anticipated, but we had, as we always did, had a backup plan for what we were going to do if there was a problem with food and water. Next slide, please. And I'm having a hard time seeing these. This is just another shot of the bringing up the supplies. This is the Fish and Wildlife team. Like I say, they were all armed. The whole team was carrying AR-15 sidearms. We had been with them to Desecheo, so we knew all of this Fish and Wildlife team. They were real good guys. Next slide, please. This is our camp structure on the island. Next slide, please. This is Fish and Wildlife's storage area for some of the weapons that they weren't carrying daily. Next slide, please. These are the Haitian fishermen that came to the island. Almost every 3 days, they would arrive at the island. The first thing they would do is come up to the old lighthouse where we were staging and fill up milk jugs with water out of the cistern. The cistern had dead animals in it and was horrible water. They would climb down in it barefooted, dip up a bucket of water, hand it to the guy up at the top of the steps, and he would pour it in a 5-gallon bucket, and they would fill the buckets with this horrible water. We never had a problem with them. Fish and Wildlife was afraid that some of the Haitians may not be friendly. That was why they were constantly armed and watching. This was the first boats that came in. They would fish for a day. The second day, the fish would be laid out on the rocks to partially dry. Then the third morning, they would load them up and take them back to Haiti. Next picture. One of the fishing crews that came twice while we were there wore no clothes at all. They sailed all the way from Haiti to Navassa with no clothes. And couldn't believe, I mean, they had nothing, no clothes at all. They were completely naked. Next slide. This is a picture of some of the areas where they were drying fish. Next slide. And as things happened, we had a slight accident on the island. One of the Fish and Wildlife guys hurt his shoulder pretty bad. And Glenn Johnson, an orthopedic surgeon that was with us, W0GJ, always carried his medical kit with him. And Glenn gets this great big grin on his face every time he gets the medical kit out, especially when he brings out the syringe with the long needle. So here he is giving one of the Fish and Wildlife guys a steroid shot in his elbow, in his shoulder. Next slide, please. This is the SSB operating tent. Next slide, please. This is a shot of me still trying to work out what we're going to do. We still don't have flights to get off the island, and we still were short a little bit of food. I kept calling, and I think this particular day I was on with the State Department and was finally told, "You're on your own. Nobody can help you." This slide is the head of the Fish and Wildlife team, Brian. He's on the phone with Department of Natural Resources and is told the same thing I'm told: you're on your own. You were told that when you went. That's why we didn't want anybody to go to Navassa. We were afraid this would happen. So figure it out. Next slide, please. Another shot of me trying to figure, well, this particular shot, we had met a guy at Ian Fleming Airport that we were pretty sure was a drug dealer. He had a little rinky-dinky plane and a little one-room shack for an office. He had an open-air hangar, and he had allowed us to use it to stage under in case the weather got bad. Dudley Beek was his name. Dudley I'd been working with prior to getting to Jamaica, and Dudley had told me, "I've got political connections, but they don't really like me in the government here. But if you get in a real jam, call me and I can probably help." Well, I'm on the phone with Dudley, and he says, "You've tried everything." I said, "We've tried everything Fish and Wildlife has." Nothing. He said, "Well, I just happened to have flown the Commissioner of Aviation to Miami 2 days ago with his girlfriend. And if I call him and say, 'Your wife wants to know what day you're coming home, and oh, by the way, we need some flight permits,' we can probably get them." Well, sure enough, the next day we got one humanitarian flight with food and water and gas, and permission to have 3 helicopter flights to leave the island. Well, it took 3 flights just to get the people there. So we ended up donating to the Haitians everything but the expensive gear. Tables, chairs, generators, gasoline was all donated to the Haitians. You couldn't believe the expressions on these guys' faces. They were crying, they were thanking us, and Fish and Wildlife had instructed them not to let anybody else in Jamaica know that they were being given these supplies, because once they got to the port, they were going to be raided by everybody else. So this isn't just another shot of me on the phone trying to make arrangements. This is Bob Alpin and I trying to make arrangements. I spent 90% of my 2 weeks on the island was spent making arrangements to leave the island after we got canceled. After we got the 3 permits to leave, it became an issue of what are we going to take with us and what are we going to give to the Haitians, because we had stuff that we had to return to vendors. We had personal gear that we weren't sure we were going to be able to take. So that was quite a bit of a problem. Then we had a ship come up that Fish and Wildlife did not recognize. So one of the guys that spotted it came back, and they all loaded up with their AR-15s and sidearms and went down to greet this fishing boat that they were hoping was a fishing boat that was coming, and hoping it wasn't a Haitian group coming to protest us being on the island. Turned out it was a fishing group that they had not seen before, so it was not a problem. Next slide. So Navassa was not a big problem other than the helicopter, but there's always some kind of glitch on these. All the planning you do, we had actually weighed out all of the gear and had all the loads staged on paper and staged and on the island and ready to, in Jamaica, ready to fly. So all of that went by the wayside after we got on the island and the flights got canceled. But it turned out to be a good operation. We made over 100,000 cues. I think it was 117,000. Well, no, it was 117,000 on Desecheo. I think it was more on Navassa. Desecheo was a similar situation. It took a number of years to get permission to go to it. Took a year and a half to organize and plan. I worked with a local ham who had just gotten his tech license, named Eladio. He had been given, we'd been given his name by Fish and Wildlife. They knew him. And Eladio was a police officer in Rincon. We tasked him with buying a lot of the merchandise we needed for the island, rather than shipping it. So he had spent weeks going to Home Depot, Gexpro Electric, getting wiring, camp infrastructure materials, staging all of those items that we were going to need. Bob Alpin and Ralph Fedor and I had gone down and had done a recon, which we always do. We had secured a Super Puma helicopter from the Puerto Rican government. It was big enough that it could carry a small office trailer. So we decided to cut down on materials and camp setup time, that we would set up the op stations in these trailers when we got to Jamaica, when we got to Puerto Rico, and we would fly the setup office container to the island. And since we were doing that, we were going to have air conditioning. We had these big 10 kW generators that were going, and everything was set to do this massive move of 3 office trailers to the island. We're literally at the airport, had cleared security, and are getting ready to board in Atlanta. Bob gets a phone call that Super Puma has been canceled, that there had been a meeting with the governor and somebody else that morning, and they had decided no more public use of the Super Puma. So we spent the whole flight, Bob and I did, figuring out what are we going to do. We don't have anything anymore. I mean, we've got nothing ordered that we can use. So next slide, please. This was the meeting the day we found out about the Super Puma, and we were sitting there going through what we were going to do. We decided the only thing to do, well, we decided before we got there, the only thing to do is the team was going to have to split up. We were going to have to take a list. We were going to have to go buy groceries. We were going to have to go buy tents, shelters, everything, smaller generators, smaller power cords. I mean, the whole camp infrastructure had to be purchased. Next slide, please. This is just another shot of the planning. We staged out of Rincon the old nuclear wastes of the nuclear site in Puerto Rico. And I don't remember how many helicopter flights we had, but we had a small helicopter, so there were one sling per helicopter load. That was 2 days of helicopter flights just back and forth. It took about 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes one way with the helicopter. So it was not a long flight, but it was long enough that there were a lot of flights. Next slide, please. We had previously, on the recon trip, we had gone down to meet with the UXO official who had to give us permission to go to the island. We had to do a UXO training, unexploded ordnance training. Desecheo had been used to dispose of armament during the war, and there was a lot of unexploded ordnance that had been dropped on the island. And that was one of the reasons nobody was allowed on Desecheo for all of these years. So we plotted out, as he was locating the UXOs, we plotted them out on GPS, put them on a map, and had our camp infrastructure and had set up paths to safely walk and safely put up antennas. Next slide, please. This is just signing some of the documents. Next slide, please. This was the food supplies. When we were doing the trailers, we had hired a chef who was going to bring his own food and own cooking supplies. Well, he canceled when he found out the Super Puma wasn't going. So at that point, we had to buy all the food for 2 weeks. So part of the team is at the grocery store buying groceries. And as things happen, the grocery store only took Visas, and the 2 guys that were there only had American Express and MasterCards. So somebody had to drive 100 miles rapidly before the store closed with a Visa card. So we got the food. That same night, we had to buy refrigerator and freezer to store the food when we got to the island. This is the first flight to the island. Next slide, please. We were going to bring in additional supplies, additional gas and water, by a ship that we had acquired when we got there after the Super Puma canceling. This is where the ship Zodiac would come in and we'd unload supplies. It was rough all the time, but we ended up having some really bad storms during the next week, and we're not able to bring the ship in or the Zodiacs in, so we couldn't get additional gas and water. Gas was the biggest problem. Next slide. So we were going to we ended up bringing in some of the gas by helicopter, a small helicopter, to get us by till we could get a shipload in. We had to go down and clear the beach of all driftwood and all of that and set up a flag and everything for the helicopter to see the land. This is at Rincon again, picking up and going. Next slide, please. This is Fish and Wildlife guiding in one of the helicopter flights. Next slide, please. This is the UXO guy. He stayed with us on the island, and as we needed to encroach on areas that had not been cleared, he would clear them for us. Next slide, please. Another shot of him clearing some beach areas. Again, him clearing some areas. Next slide, please. This is a shot of the camp infrastructure from up on the upper level where we were not allowed to go, but we did get up there to take some pictures. Next slide, please. This is bringing in, well, this is actually leaving. We had flown over a double-door refrigerator and a freezer. There was a surfing competition in Rincon the week we were doing this. And Eladio, the policeman, says, we're getting constant calls at the police station that there is nuclear waste being carried from the nuke site out to sea, and the helicopters are coming back empty. What's going on? So we had to straighten out with some government officials that we were not taking nuclear waste. It was going to Navassa. It took a little 30, 40 minutes, but it was one of those little glitches that comes up. This is, again, a shot of one of the helicopters coming in. Next flight. This is, that's just the flags. We had Canadians with us on this trip. Next slide. Neil King was with us. And I think he was the only Canadian with us on this trip. Next slide. Well, this is inside the op station. Next slide. One of the things we had to do in order to get to the island was Fish and Wildlife would not pay any cost. We had to support them 100%. And in addition to supporting them, Island Conservation was doing a cleanup of the island. And this was their first trip to the island, and we had to support them fully. We had to pay their transportation and their food. So this is one of the ladies that was with Island Conservation. Fish and Wildlife had a sting operation going on while we were there. They were trying to catch some human smugglers that were dropping people off at Desachello on a weekly basis. They had to have a U.S. phone number. So we had set up a V over IP phone with satellite and were able to make phone calls. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Billy, Fish and Wildlife head of this job, of this DXpedition, he and I were going down every morning to try to see if we could get a ship in or not. And this was one of the mornings that we went down. We both almost got washed out to sea. A wave came in, a huge wave came in, knocked us both down, and I grabbed a rock, Billy grabbed a rock, and we held on, and the only sat phone on the island was drowned in salt water. Next phone, next picture. This is Island Conservation's team, and I'm in the shot too. Next slide. This is me trying to dry out the sat phone. Next slide, please. Those are the little glitches that happen, is there's always crazy things that you don't anticipate. We figured if we got a V over IP phone and satellite, we don't need more than one Iridium sat phone. Well, as it turned out, the team member that was supplying the satellite gear fell through and had a residential satellite dish that had a feed horn on it that was broken, and he had the wrong information about what sat we were supposed to be hitting. We got a sat connection for 30 minutes, then we lost it, never had it again. So we needed that phone bad. So once I got the phone working, I got it working all but the zero. You couldn't use the zero. Fortunately, all the numbers that I needed to call that had a zero was stored in the phone. So we were able to make calls. Let's see what this is. Oh, we did eventually, the last week, we did eventually get Zodiacs in with more fuel. The team was split into two teams. We had a team 1 and a team 2, and when we changed teams at the end of the first week, we were able to get the ship in with more gas and more food, and we had set up a little area where we were going to bring the stuff from the Zodiac onto this landing area and then take it to the beach. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, this is the little gantry deal that we set up to pick the stuff out of the Zodiac and get it to the island. Next slide, please. That's a picture of the SDVAs on the beach. They worked out really well. Took a lot of maintenance, though. We had to go down and pour fresh water on the coils 4 or 5 times a day to get the salt off of them. Next slide. The generators worked perfect, except for we almost ran out of gas. We had 5 gallons of gas left one morning, no hopes of getting gas that day. So we decided to shut off everything but one generator. And next slide, please. Well, I thought I had a picture. We ended up having to take the 5 feeds to the op tent, combine them into one feed, cut off most of the gear in the op tent, and just have one line active going into the op tent. see what this is. This is actually leaving the island. That was the biggest problem we had, was juggling the gas and having to restage everything in the beginning. After we got restaged, we were okay. The gas was the next biggest problem. We did have a lot of rats crawling across the keyboards, iguanas crawling across the keyboards, on your feet, in your bunks. One team member woke up in the middle of the night with something on his neck, and it was a rat laying on his neck. It was cool that night, and the rat was laying on his warm neck, and Gary jumped up and hit the guy's bunk above. The bunk collapsed, and it was a calamity that night. I had decided I was not going to sleep in the sleep shelter because it's too noisy, so I was sleeping in a hammock tent. And all night long, there were snakes and lizards and rats running across the top of the hammock tent. It was interesting. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. This is leaving. We ended up with 2 helicopters taking us back to the island, just one right after another. Next slide, please. Do what? Oh, we're in Iowa? Oh, sorry about that. Well, these are the things that happen. You just don't expect them. Bouvet was a big problem, which I was going to get into, but I didn't realize I'd taken up this much time. There's always excitement, always unexpected. No matter how much you plan and organize, there's always issues. Appreciate the time. Sorry I took it all up on those, but thank you for having me.
Obviously, that kind of DX expeditioning is not for the faint of heart. Thank you very much, George. I knew you would have some pretty good stories to tell us, and very much appreciate